Sometimes the things we inherit carry more weight than money can measure. When 43-year-old cowboy Amos Ray inherits his uncle's forgotten ranch, the whole town laughs at the moss-covered ruin left to a poor drifter. They see nothing but decay and bad memories. But Amos remembers boyhood summers there, before life wore him down. As he clears away decades of neglect with his donkey Clementine, he discovers something in the attic, old land deeds and ledgers telling a different story. The overgrown property sits on mineral rights worth $10 million. But when old rivals emerge with claims and threats, will Amos fight for what's rightfully his, or will the town's mockery and his own past finally break him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, carried by a mail rider who looked at Amos Ray like he was delivering bad news instead of an inheritance. Amos had been mucking stalls at the Broken Spur Ranch outside of Cedar Bluff when the boss hollered for him to come up to the main house. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting spidery and formal. Inside, a lawyer from 3 counties over informed him that his uncle Ezra Ray had passed away 6 months prior, and that Amos was the sole heir to the old Whispering Pines Ranch. Amos stood there on the porch of someone else's ranch house, hat in his calloused hands, reading those words twice before they settled in. Ezra Ray. He hadn't seen his uncle in 25 years, not since that last summer when he was 18, and the world still felt like it might open up for him. That was before the years of drifting from ranch to ranch, before his back started aching on cold mornings, before the lines around his eyes got deep enough to hold shadows. Bad news, the boss asked, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "My uncle died," Amos said quietly. "Left me his ranch." The boss let out a low whistle that wasn't quite sympathetic.
Whispering Pines?
"That old ruin out past Thornton Creek." "Yes, sir, I believe so." "Well," the boss shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "I suppose congratulations are in order, though I'm not sure for what. That place has been empty for longer than most folks can remember. Heard it's more moss than wood these days." Amos folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "I appreciate the years of work here, sir. I'll finish out the week if that suits you." The boss nodded, already turning back inside. "Suit yourself." That was how it went in Cedar Bluff. Amos had worked at the Broken Spur for 3 years, and the goodbye was as brief as the hiring had been. He'd learned long ago that a drifting cowboy doesn't gather much loyalty, only paychecks that barely stretch to the next town. At 43, he'd lived in more bunkhouses than he could count, owned less than would fill a wagon, and had exactly $417 saved in a coffee tin under his cot. By Friday, he'd collected his pay, loaded his few belongings onto a borrowed wagon, and headed out toward the old Whispering Pines Ranch with his donkey Clementine tethered behind. Clementine was a gray Jenny he'd won in a card game 2 years back, too stubborn to sell and too loyal to leave behind. She had a lopsided ear and a habit of braying at dawn, but she was steady company on a long road. The ride from Cedar Bluff to the ranch took most of the day. The countryside rolled gently at first, scattered with cattle ranches and wheat fields, turning gold under the autumn sun. But as he pushed deeper into the territory beyond Thornton Creek, the land changed. The trees grew thicker, their branches reaching across the narrow road like arthritic fingers. Moss hung from the oaks in great grey curtains, giving the woods a hushed, secretive quality. Birds called from hidden perches, and the air smelled of damp earth and rot and something older, like time itself had settled into the soil. He'd forgotten how wild this country was, how it felt separate from the tamed ranches and neat fences of Cedar Bluff. This was land that hadn't been fully broken, that still remembered what it was before people carved it into property lines. The Whispering Pines Ranch sat at the end of a long, overgrown drive marked by a weathered wooden arch that sagged on one side. The name had been burned into a plank 30 years ago, but the letters were barely legible now, swallowed by lichen and neglect. Amos pulled the wagon to a stop and just looked. The ranch house stood 2 stories tall, its whitewashed boards turned gray and green with moss. Vines climbed the walls like they were trying to pull the whole structure back into the earth. The porch sagged in the middle, and several windows were boarded over with planks that had themselves begun to rot. The barn beyond was in even worse shape, its roof partially collapsed, its doors hanging askew. Everywhere he looked, he saw decades of abandonment, nature reclaiming what man had briefly held. But underneath all that decay, he could still see the bones of what it had been. The house had good proportions, built by someone who knew their craft. The barn was positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun. And the land, Lord, the land stretched out in every direction. Hundreds of acres of wild meadow and timber, bounded by the dark line of mountains in the distance. Clementine brayed, long and loud, her voice echoing across the empty property. "I know." "Girl," Amos said softly, "looks like we've got our work cut out for us." He unhitched her and led her to what remained of the barn, finding a stall that still had 3 walls and a mostly intact roof. He gave her water from the creek that ran behind the property, then returned to the house with his bedroll and the coffee tin that held his life savings. The front door was locked, but the key had come with the letter. It turned with a rusty scrape, and the door swung inward on protesting hinges. The smell hit him first, must and dust and old wood, but not the fetid stench of true rot. That was something, at least. The place was empty, but it wasn't dead. Inside, the main room held the ghostly outlines of furniture long removed. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and cobwebs draped the corners like ancient lace. But the windows, even boarded over, let in thin lines of light that showed him the craftsmanship in the place. Hand-carved trim around the doorways. A stone fireplace built with careful precision. Floorboards of solid oak, warped but unbroken. Amos walked through the house room by room, his boots leaving tracks in the dust. In the kitchen, the old cast-iron stove still stood against the far wall, and the hand pump at the sink gave a reluctant trickle of rusty water when he worked the handle. Upstairs, he found 3 bedrooms, all empty except for the memories they held. He stopped at the door to what must have been his uncle's room. The last time he'd been here, Amos had been a boy of 12, sent to stay the summer because his mother was sick and his father was drinking. Uncle Ezra had been a quiet man, weathered by sun and work, but he'd been kind in his way. He'd taught Amos how to mend fence, how to read the sky for weather, how to sit with silence instead of fearing it. That summer had been the last good summer of Amos's boyhood. The last time he'd felt like the world might hold something for him besides hardship. He found his uncle's journal in the bedroom closet, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a wooden box. The leather cover was worn smooth by years of handling, and the pages inside were filled with neat, cramped handwriting. Amos sat on the dusty floor and read by the failing light from the window. The entries were sparse, more accounting than diary. Notes about fence repairs, cattle counts, the price of supplies in town. But scattered throughout were other observations, things that made Amos's chest tighten. A line about the land being worth more than people knew. A mention of railroad surveyors passing through years ago. A note about keeping certain documents safe. The last entry was dated 3 years before his uncle's death. It simply read, "For Amos if he ever comes back." The land remembers. He sat there as the light faded, holding that journal and feeling the weight of 25 lost years. He should have come back. Should have written, at least. But he'd been ashamed of how his life had turned out. The drifting, the scraping by, the slow erosion of whatever dreams he'd once held. It had seemed easier to disappear than to face his uncle's disappointment. Now Ezra was gone, and all Amos had were these cryptic notes and a ranch falling into ruin. He spent that first night in the main room downstairs, his bedroll spread before the cold fireplace. Through the broken boards over the windows, he could hear the night sounds of the wild country, owls calling, something larger moving through the brush, the constant whisper of wind through pine branches that gave the ranch its name. In the morning, he would start cleaning, start making the place livable again. But tonight he just lay there in the dark and listened to the house settling around him, wondering what his uncle had meant by those final words. The land remembers. Remembers what? And why had Ezra left it all to a nephew who'd vanished into his own failures? Outside, Clementine brayed once, then fell silent. The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards. And somewhere in the attic above, something creaked like footsteps. Amos closed his eyes and let exhaustion take him, unaware that in Cedar Bluff, news of his inheritance was already spreading through the town like wildfire. And not everyone was pleased that the old Whispering Pines ranch had finally found an heir. The first week passed in a blur of hard work and rediscovery. Amos cleared the vines from the porch, replaced 3 rotted boards, and got the hand pump in the kitchen flowing clean water. He patched the worst holes in the barn roof and built Clementine a proper stall with fresh straw he'd hauled from town. Each day he fell into bed exhausted, his hands blistered and his back aching, but there was something good in the soreness, something that felt like purpose. On his second trip into Cedar Bluff for supplies, the mockery started in earnest. He was loading fence posts into the wagon when he heard the laughter from across the street. 3 men sat on the bench outside the general store, and one of them, a thick-bodied fellow named Garrett, who owned a prosperous cattle spread, called out loud enough for half the street to hear, "There goes the Lord of Whispering Pines. You getting that place fixed up, Amos, or just making it comfortable for the rats?" The other men laughed, and Garrett continued, warming to his audience. "I heard you inherited a real prize there, a moss palace. Must be worth at least $10, maybe 15 if you count the nails." Amos kept loading his posts, not rising to the bait. He'd learned long ago that men like Garrett fed on reactions. "My daddy told me that place was cursed," one of the other men said. Said Ezra Ray went half crazy out there all alone, talking to himself, seeing things that weren't there. "Well, now his nephew's doing the same," Garrett said. "Takes a special kind of fool to think you can make something of that ruin. Amos, you'd be better off walking away. Sell it for whatever you can get and find yourself a proper job." Amos tied down his load and climbed onto the wagon seat. He met Garrett's eyes across the street and just nodded once, polite as Sunday church. Then he clicked his tongue and drove away, their laughter following him down the dusty main street. It shouldn't have bothered him. He'd been mocked before, had endured worse than small-town ridicule. But something about it settled wrong in his chest. Maybe it was hearing his uncle called crazy. Maybe it was the way they'd already dismissed him before he'd even had a chance to prove otherwise. Or maybe it was because part of him feared they were right. He pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the work. There was too much to do to waste time on wounded pride. It was on the 8th day that he finally climbed into the attic. He'd been putting it off, partly because the ladder was half-rotted, and partly because attics had a way of holding too many ghosts. But the roof had a leak above the second bedroom, and he needed to patch it before the autumn rains began in earnest. The attic was low-ceilinged and sweltering, even with the cool September air outside. Light filtered through gaps in the roof boards, casting pale stripes across decades of accumulated dust. Old furniture sat shrouded in canvas, and cardboard boxes lined the walls, their contents long forgotten. Amos found the leak easily enough, a section where the boards had rotted through completely. He made a mental note of what he'd need to fix it, then turned to climb back down. But something caught his eye. A trunk pushed into the far corner beneath the eaves, half hidden behind a broken rocking chair. It was an old cavalry trunk, military issue from what he could tell, with reinforced corners and a heavy padlock that had rusted open. Amos pulled it out into better light and opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, were stacks of documents. Old land deeds, their paper yellowed and brittle. Survey maps with careful notations. Letters from railroad companies dated back to the 1880s. And beneath it all, a set of leather-bound ledgers filled with his uncle's handwriting. Amos carried the trunk downstairs and spread the documents across the kitchen table. It took him hours to sort through it all, piecing together a story that had been hidden in this attic for who knew how long. The Whispering Pines Ranch, it turned out. had been in the Ray family since 1876. His great-grandfather had claimed it under the Homestead Act, built the house, and raised cattle on the wild land. But the real value hadn't been in the cattle. According to the documents, the property sat on a route that the railroad surveyors had marked as prime territory for expansion. More than that, the land held mineral rights, copper, silver, and something the ledgers referred to as probable oil deposits. His uncle Ezra had known. The ledgers showed years of careful research, correspondence with surveyors and geologists, legal consultation. There were maps marking the best sites for drilling, estimates of the land's value if the minerals were ever extracted. And there, in his uncle's neat handwriting at the bottom of the most recent ledger entry, value estimated between $8 and $12 million. Depending on market conditions and extraction costs, Amos sat back in his chair, the number echoing in his mind like a struck bell, $8 and $12 million. He read through the documents again, slower this time, making sure he understood. The property was over 600 acres. The mineral rights had never been sold or separated from the land deed. His uncle had kept it all secret, living like a hermit in this decaying house while sitting on a fortune. But why? Why had Ezra never developed it, never sold it, never even mentioned it? The answer came from a letter tucked into the back of one ledger, addressed to Ezra from a lawyer in Cheyenne, and dated 15 years ago. It warned that someone had tried to file a claim against the property, asserting that the original deed was invalid due to a surveying error in 1876. The claim had been dismissed, but the lawyer advised keeping all documentation secure and being wary of further attempts. Someone had tried to take the land before, and now that Ezra was gone and Amos had inherited it, that someone might try again. He looked up from the papers, suddenly aware of how isolated the ranch was. How far from town, from witnesses, from help. The house felt different now, less like a refuge and more like a target. The creaking boards and settling timbers took on a sinister quality, as if the place itself was warning him. Outside, Clementine let out a sharp bray of alarm. Amos moved to the window and peered through the gap in the boards. A rider was coming up the overgrown drive, moving slowly, looking the place over with the careful attention of someone cataloguing weaknesses. The man was well dressed for the territory. Clean hat, tailored vest, a horse too fine for casual visiting. The rider stopped in front of the house and called out, "Hello, the house!" "Amos Ray?" Amos pushed open the front door and stepped onto the porch, keeping his hand near the old revolver his uncle had left in the nightstand drawer. "That's me," the man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Dalton Hayes. I'm a land agent working for the Cedar Valley Development Company. I heard you inherited this property, and I wanted to make you an offer. Property's not for sale. Now, don't be hasty." Hayes dismounted and took a step closer, his smile fixed in place. "I understand you've got some repairs to do, and that takes money. We're prepared to offer you $50,000 for the land, cash payment within the week. That's more than fair for a place in this condition. $50,000. A fortune to a drifting cowboy. Enough to buy a small ranch or live comfortably for years." But after what he'd just read, after seeing that $8 to $12 million estimate, the offer felt like an insult. "I said it's not for sale." Hayes's smile faltered. "Mr. Ray, I don't think you understand the situation. This land has complications. There are questions about the deed, about whether your uncle had clear title. You could spend years in court just trying to prove you own it. We're offering you a clean exit, and I'm telling you no." The two men stared at each other across the weedy yard. Finally, Hayes nodded slowly and remounted his horse. "You should reconsider, Mr. Ray. A man alone out here, accidents happen. It would be a shame if something happened to you before you had a chance to enjoy your inheritance." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving Amos standing on the porch with his heart pounding and his hand still resting on the revolver's grip. It wasn't just mockery anymore. This was something darker, something dangerous. The land was worth millions, and someone knew it. Someone who'd been waiting for Ezra to die so they could swoop in and claim it. Amos looked down at his calloused hands, then back at the house with its moss-covered walls and rotting boards. He was just a drifting cowboy with $400 and a stubborn donkey. What chance did he have against land agents and development companies and whoever else wanted this property badly enough to threaten him? But then he thought of his uncle, living out here alone for all those years, guarding this secret. Ezra had held on, had fought to keep it safe, waiting for someone to leave it to, waiting for Amos. The land remembers. His uncle had written. Maybe it was time Amos remembered who he was, too. That night, Amos slept with the revolver under his pillow and woke at every sound. The house's settling timbers became footsteps. The wind through the pines became whispered threats. By dawn, he was exhausted and jumpy. His nerves stretched thin as fence wire. He needed help. That much was clear. But who could he trust in a town that had already written him off as a fool? The answer came from an unexpected source. He was repairing the porch railing 2 days after Hayes's visit when an old pickup truck rattled up the drive. The driver was a woman about his age, maybe a few years older, with gray streaking her dark hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent her life outdoors. She stepped out of the truck with a basket covered in checkered cloth. "Amos Ray," she called. "I'm Margaret Pritchard. I run the diner in town." He set down his hammer and came down the steps, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Ma'am, I brought you some bread and stew," she said, offering the basket. "Figured you might be tired of your own cooking." He took it, surprised by the gesture. "That's kind of you." "I don't believe we've met." "No, but I knew your uncle." She looked past him at the house, her expression softening. "Ezra used to come into town once a month, regular as clockwork. Always sat at the same table, always ordered the same meal. We'd talk sometimes, when the place wasn't busy. He was a good man." Something in her voice told Amos there was more to it than that. "He spoke of you?" "Some." She met his eyes, and he saw a depth of sorrow there that spoke of old grief, carefully tended. "I was married once, but my husband passed 12 years ago. Ezra and I, well, we understood each other. Two lonely people finding comfort in conversation. Nothing more than that, but it meant something." Amos nodded slowly. "I'm sorry I didn't come back sooner. Didn't get to see him before he passed. He understood why you stayed away. Told me once that you reminded him too much of himself at that age, full of pride and hurt and trying to outrun both." She looked at him steadily. "He also told me that if you ever came back you'd need friends. So here I am." The simple kindness of it hit him harder than he expected. He'd been alone so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone just show up and offer help. "There's a lawyer in town," Margaret continued, "named Samuel Booth. He handled some business for Ezra over the years, kept it quiet. You should talk to him before this thing with the land development company gets worse. How'd you know about that?" She gave him a look that was almost maternal. "Small town, Amos. Hayes has been bragging at the saloon about how he's going to get this property for pennies. Says you don't know what you're sitting on." "I know exactly what I'm sitting on," Amos said quietly. "Found my uncle's papers. The land's worth millions." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look surprised. Ezra hinted as much, that this place was his legacy, but he needed to leave it to someone strong enough to hold on to it. She paused. "You strong enough, Amos?" He thought about that. About the years of drifting, the failures, and the worn-down pride. "I don't know. But I'm going to try. That's all anyone can do." She climbed back into her truck, then leaned out the window. "Samuel Booth's office is above the bank. Tell him I sent you. And Amos, watch your back. The Cedar Valley Development Company isn't just some land agent. They've got connections, money, and they don't like being told no." She drove away in a cloud of dust, leaving Amos standing there with a basket of food and the first real hope he'd felt since Hayes's visit. The next morning, he rode into Cedar Bluff and found Samuel Booth's office exactly where Margaret said it would be. The lawyer was a thin man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone who'd learned to keep secrets. He listened as Amos explained the situation, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When Amos finished, Booth removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. a gesture that seemed to buy him time to think. "Your uncle was a client of mine for 30 years. I handled the probate, made sure the inheritance was legally sound. But I'm going to be frank with you, Mr. Ray. What you're dealing with is bigger than small-town law." "How so?" "The Cedar Valley Development Company is owned by a man named Victor Thornhill. He's a mining and railroad magnate out of Cheyenne, worth more money than you can count. He's been trying to acquire your land since before you were born. Made Ezra dozens of offers over the years, each one higher than the last." "Ezra always refused." Amos leaned forward. "Why does Thornhill want it so badly?" "Because 15 years ago, he hired surveyors who confirmed what Ezra already suspected. There's copper under that land, possibly oil, and the property sits on the perfect route for a railroad expansion that would make Thornhill even richer than he already is." Booth put his glasses back on. "He tried legal challenges, claiming the original deed was fraudulent. That failed. He tried buying up the adjacent properties to pressure Ezra. That failed too. Now Ezra's dead, and you're here, and Thornhill sees an opportunity. He thinks I'll sell, or that he can force you to." Booth opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "I took the liberty of pulling together everything I have on file. Your deed is solid. The mineral rights are yours. But Thornhill has lawyers, judges in his pocket, and the kind of influence that can make your life very difficult. If you're going to fight this, you need to be prepared for a long battle." Amos looked at the folder, then at the lawyer. "Will you help me?" "I'll do what I can, but my practice is small-town wills and property disputes. You need someone with experience in corporate law, mining rights, maybe even criminal defense if things get ugly." He paused. "That said, I knew Ezra, respected him. I'll stand with you as long as I'm able." They shook hands across the desk, and Amos felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. He had an ally now, someone who understood the legal terrain. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had yesterday. He spent the rest of the day in Booth's office, going through documents and learning the history of his land. There was an 1876 survey map, hand-drawn and remarkably detailed, that showed the original boundaries. There were contracts from Ezra's failed attempts to partner with honest mining companies. And there was a photograph, creased and faded, of a young Amos standing beside his uncle in front of the ranch house when the paint was still white and the porch still straight. Amos stared at that photograph for a long time. He'd been 12 years old, skinny and serious, looking at the camera like he was afraid it might steal something from him. His uncle stood with one hand on his shoulder, protective and proud. "The land remembers," Booth said quietly, looking at the photo. "That's what Ezra told me the last time I saw him. Said the land remembers those who care for it, and it has a way of caring back." Amos folded the photograph carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. Then he gathered the documents Booth was lending him and headed back to the ranch, already planning his next move. He had the legal paperwork. He had allies, however few. Now he needed to make the ranch defensible, both literally and figuratively. Because if Thornhill was as dangerous as Booth suggested, the threats were only beginning. The harassment started small. A broken fence that let Clementine wander onto the road. Supplies that went missing from the barn. His wagon wheel loosened just enough that it nearly came off on the drive back from town. Each incident could have been coincidence, but together they formed a pattern that made Amos sleep even lighter than before. He didn't report any of it. What would he say? That someone was playing pranks? That he felt watched? The sheriff in Cedar Bluff was a man named Hendricks, and Amos had seen him sharing drinks with Dalton Hayes at the saloon. Complaining would only let them know their tactics were working. Instead, he fortified. He fixed the fences properly, digging new post holes and stringing wire tight enough to keep Clementine contained. He bought a padlock for the barn and got into the habit of doing a full inventory of his supplies each night. He varied his route to town, never taking the same path twice in a row. Small precautions, the kind a man learned after years of drifting through places where being careless could cost you everything. On the third week, Margaret brought more than food. She brought company. The man who climbed out of her truck was Native American, maybe 60 years old, with long grey hair tied back and hands scarred by decades of hard work. He moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been broken and healed too many times to count. "This is Joseph Running Bear," Margaret said. "He worked for your uncle off and on for 20 years. Thought you two should meet." Joseph extended his hand, and Amos shook it, feeling the strength still there despite the age. "Sir," just Joseph. His voice was gravelly, like he didn't use it much. "Ezra was a good man. Fair. When I heard you were trying to hold on to this place, I figured you might need help. I could use it," Amos admitted. "Though I can't pay much. Didn't ask for pay." "Asked if you needed help." Joseph looked around the property with an appraising eye. "Lot of work here. Barn needs more than patching. That fence line along the eastern boundary is gone completely. And if you're going to stay, you'll need to secure the water rights to Thornton Creek." Water rights. Margaret and Joseph exchanged a look, and Margaret sighed. "The creek that runs through your property feeds into the valley below. Several ranches depend on it. If someone could prove you're not maintaining the water flow properly, they could petition to have your water rights revoked. It's a legal maneuver Thornhill's used before. So I need to clear the creek, make sure it's flowing free. And document it," Joseph added. "Photographs, witnesses, official statements. Everything by the book, so they can't twist it against you." Amos felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders again. It wasn't enough to own the land legally. He had to prove he could manage it responsibly, had to defend against attacks from every angle. It was exhausting, and he'd barely begun. But Joseph's steady presence helped. The older man started working alongside him the next day, and his knowledge of the land proved invaluable. He knew which trees marked the old boundary lines, where the springs ran strongest, how the weather patterns moved through the valley. He'd learned it all working for Ezra, and now he passed it on to Amos like a legacy. "Your uncle loved this place," Joseph said one afternoon as they cleared brush from the creek bed. "Not for what it was worth in money, for what it was worth in memory. His family built it from nothing, and he couldn't stand the thought of it being torn apart by men who only saw dollar signs. But he never developed it himself, never used the mineral rights, because developing it would have meant destroying it." Joseph straightened, pressing a hand to his lower back. "The copper's deep. You'd need to bring in heavy equipment, dig down hundreds of feet, scar the land for decades. The oil, if it's even there, would mean wells and pipelines cutting through meadows his great-grandfather planted. Ezra couldn't do it, wouldn't do it, so he just sat on a fortune and lived like he had nothing. He had everything that mattered to him. This land, his memories, his peace." Joseph looked at him directly. "Question is, what matters to you?" Amos didn't answer right away. He thought about the years of drifting, working other men's ranches, never putting down roots. He'd told himself it was freedom, but maybe it was just running. Running from the responsibility of caring about something enough to fight for it. "I think I'm starting to figure that out," he said finally. They worked in companionable silence after that, and by evening they'd cleared a 100-yard stretch of creek, the water flowing clean and strong. Joseph produced a camera from his truck, an old Polaroid, and took photographs of the work, noting the date on the back of each picture. "Evidence," he said. "Everything needs to be documented now." That night, after Joseph had driven home, Amos explored more of the property boundaries. He found the old survey markers his great-grandfather had placed in 1876, stone cairns stacked by hand, each one carefully positioned according to the original deed. Some had been knocked over by time and weather, but most stood firm, silent witnesses to more than a century of ownership. At the eastern boundary, he found something else. A new surveyor's stake driven into the ground within the last few weeks. The marker was bright orange, impossible to miss, and it sat a good 50 yards inside his property line. Someone was challenging his boundaries. Amos pulled the stake from the ground and examined it. There were initials carved into the wood, CVDC Cedar Valley Development Company. They weren't even being subtle about it anymore. He carried the stake back to the house and added it to the growing pile of evidence he was collecting. The photograph Joseph had taken went into his uncle's ledger alongside the old deed. The survey map from Booth's office went on the kitchen table where he could reference it easily, and the illegal boundary marker went on the mantel above the fireplace, a reminder of what he was fighting against. The next morning, he rode into town and filed a formal complaint with the county surveyor's office about the fraudulent marker. The clerk was sympathetic, but warned him that disputes like this could take months to resolve, especially if the other party had expensive lawyers. "They're trying to wear you down," the clerk said. An elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd been working there for 40 years. "Make you spend money on lawyers and surveys and documents until you're broke and desperate. Then they'll offer you just enough to walk away." "I'm not walking away." She smiled at that, though it was tinged with sadness. "Your uncle said the same thing. Every time they came after him, he stood his ground. But it cost him, Mr. Ray, cost him his health, his peace, maybe even some years of his life. Make sure you know what you're getting into." He thanked her and left, but her words stayed with him all the way back to the ranch. Was he being brave or just stubborn? Was he fighting for something real or just too proud to admit defeat? The answer came that evening as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the valley in shades of gold and amber. He stood on the porch of the old house, looking out at land his family had held for 5 generations, and he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about money or pride or proving the townspeople wrong. It was about legacy. About the hands that had built this place, and the sweat that had watered it, and the dreams that had sustained it. His great-grandfather had staked this claim when the West was still wild. His uncle had guarded it against men who would have stripped it bare for profit. Now it was Amos's turn to hold the line, and he'd be damned if he failed them. The first real blow came in the form of a lawsuit. Samuel Booth delivered the papers himself, driving out to the ranch on a grey October morning when frost still clung to the grass. His face was grim, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Thornhill's company is claiming adverse possession on the eastern 40 acres, he said, spreading the documents on the kitchen table. "They say they've been maintaining that section for over 20 years, and since your uncle never challenged them, they have a legal right to it." Amos felt his chest tighten. "That's a lie. My uncle walked every inch of this property. I know it is. But they have documentation, photographs, maintenance logs, affidavits from workers who claim they cleared brush and repaired fences on that land for years." Booth removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "It's all fabricated, but it looks official. And the judge assigned to the case is Harvey Morrison, who happens to be Thornhill's brother-in-law. So I've already lost." "Not necessarily. We can petition for a change of venue, argue judicial bias. But it'll take time and money. Legal fees for something like this could run $5,000, maybe more. $5,000. More than 10 times what Amos had in his coffee tin. He sat down heavily, feeling the full weight of his situation. He'd been poor his whole life. But poverty had always meant freedom, too. No responsibilities, no stakes, nothing to lose. Now he had something worth fighting for, and he didn't have the resources to fight. "There's another option," Booth said carefully. Thornhill made a new offer through his lawyers. $200,000 for the entire property. You'd have to sign away all mineral rights and agree never to contest any future development in the area, but you'd walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. $200,000. It was a fortune. More money than Amos would make in 10 lifetimes of drifting cowboy work. He could buy a small ranch somewhere else, build a real life, stop fighting for once. But it was still less than 2% of what the land was actually worth. "They think I'm desperate enough to take it," he said quietly. "Are you?" Amos looked around the kitchen at his uncle's ledgers on the table, at the old photograph of him and Ezra on the wall, at the moss-covered window that looked out on land that had been in his family for 5 generations. "No. Tell them no." Booth smiled slightly, though it was tinged with worry. "Then we fight. I'll file our response by the end of the week. In the meantime, I need you to do something for me. Find witnesses, anyone who can testify that your uncle maintained that eastern section, that the fence line was clear, that no one from the development company was ever working there. We need to counter their fabricated evidence with truth. Joseph was the obvious choice. He'd worked the land for 20 years and knew every acre. But when Amos drove to his small house on the edge of the reservation that afternoon, he found the older man sitting on his porch with a split lip and a bruise darkening his left eye. What happened? "Couple of men came by last night," Joseph said, his voice calm despite the injury. "Asked if I'd be willing to testify in court about boundaries I might or might not have seen. Said it would be real unfortunate if I got confused about what I remembered." Anger flared hot in Amos's chest. "They beat you up?" "Just roughed me up a little. Made their point." Joseph met his eyes steadily. "I'm still testifying." "Told them that too. But you should know what you're dealing with. These men don't play fair. I'm starting to understand that." Amos sat down on the porch steps. "Maybe you shouldn't get involved. This isn't your fight. Ezra was my friend. This land matters, and watching rich men steal from good people, that never sits right with me." He shifted in his chair, wincing. "Besides, I've been beat up before. Takes more than that to scare me off." They sat in silence for a while, watching the clouds build over the mountains. Finally, Joseph spoke again. "Your uncle kept something hidden in the barn, under the loose floorboards in the tack room. Said if anything ever happened to him, whoever inherited should know about it." Amos's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "Don't know. Never looked. But he made a point of telling me where it was, about a month before he died. Said it was insurance." Back at the ranch, Amos went straight to the barn's tack room. The floorboards were old pine, warped and gapped. He tested each one until he found the loose section Joseph had described, pried it up with a crowbar, and reached into the dark space beneath. His fingers closed on oilcloth, wrapped around something solid. He pulled it out and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a gun. Not the old revolver from the nightstand, but a Colt Peacemaker, lovingly maintained. Its barrel engraved with the name James Ray, 1876, his great-grandfather's sidearm from when he first claimed the land. It was a piece of family history, passed down through generations, and his uncle had hidden it like a talisman. Beneath the gun was a small leather notebook, different from the ledgers upstairs. Amos opened it and found a different kind of accounting. This one recorded incidents, threats made against Ezra over the years, attempts to intimidate him, names, dates, and descriptions of men who'd come to the property with offers that weren't really offers. And at the bottom of the last page, a note in Ezra's handwriting: "They broke my body, but not my will. The land stays in the family." Let Amos know he doesn't have to face this alone. Tell him to look for allies in unexpected places. Amos sat there in the dusty tack room, holding his great-grandfather's gun and reading his uncle's secret history of resistance. Ezra had endured years of this, had stood firm despite threats, despite loneliness, despite failing health. And he'd done it believing that someday Amos would come back, that the land would pass to someone who'd value it for more than its mineral rights. The weight of that faith was almost crushing. That night, Margaret brought dinner again, and this time she didn't leave right away. They sat on the porch together, eating chicken and potatoes while the stars came out overhead. "Joseph told me what happened," she said, "about the lawsuit and the men who threatened him. I'm starting to think Booth was right. This fight is bigger than I can handle." "Maybe it is." She set down her plate and looked at him. "But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is standing up anyway, even when you know you might lose. That's what Ezra did. He didn't win every battle, but he never surrendered, and it killed him. Living killed him. We all die eventually," she smiled sadly. "But he died knowing he'd held on to something that mattered. How many people can say that?" Amos didn't answer. He just sat there, feeling the cool night air and listening to the wind through the pines. Somewhere in the darkness, Clementine brayed softly, and he heard the barn door creak on its hinges. Tomorrow he'd go back to town and help Booth prepare their legal defense. He'd document everything, gather evidence, build their case. He'd do whatever it took to hold this ground, but tonight he let himself feel the fear. Let himself acknowledge that he was one man against a system designed to crush people like him. let himself wonder if he was brave or just foolish. The answer, he suspected, wouldn't be clear until it was all over. The county land office held records going back to territorial days, stored in a basement that smelled of mildew and old paper. Amos spent 3 days there, going through dusty file boxes while the clerk, Mrs. Chen, brought him coffee and pointed him toward the most promising leads. "You're looking for contradictions," she explained. "If the development company claims they've been maintaining that land for 20 years, there should be permits, tax payments, official correspondence. If there isn't, their case falls apart." She was right. The official record showed no permits for work on the eastern 40 acres of Whispering Pines Ranch. No maintenance claims filed with the county. No tax assessments that would indicate the development company had any legal interest in the property before now. Their documentation was all internal, photographs and logs that could have been created yesterday and backdated, but proving they were fraudulent would be another matter. On the 4th day, Mrs. Chen pulled him aside with a manila folder she'd found in the archives. "This might interest you. It's from 1952. Inside was correspondence between the county and the railroad company that had once surveyed the area. There were maps, proposals for expansion routes, and, most importantly, a letter from Amos's grandfather declining an offer to sell an easement through the property. The letter was polite but firm, explaining that the land had been in the family since 1876 and would remain so. "This proves my family has been actively managing the property for generations," Amos said. "More than that, look at who signed the railroad company's offer letter." Amos looked. The signature was nearly illegible, but the typed name beneath it was clear: Victor Thornhill Sr. "Thornhill's father tried to buy the land 70 years ago, Mrs. Chen said. "This isn't some new business venture. It's a grudge that's been passed down through generations." The realization settled over Amos like a cold weight. This wasn't just about money or development. It was personal. The Thornhill family had wanted this land for 3 generations, and they'd never forgiven the Ray family for refusing to sell. He copied everything in the folder, paid for the copies with money he could barely afford to spend, and drove back to the ranch feeling like he'd uncovered something important, but not quite sure what to do with it. That evening, he had unexpected visitors. 3 men on horseback came up the drive just before sunset. They weren't dressed like ranch hands or development company agents. They wore the plain clothes of working men, denim and flannel, scuffed boots and weathered hats. The oldest of them, a man with a thick grey beard, called out a greeting before dismounting. "Amos Ray. Name's Frank Hollister. These are my boys, Tom and David. We run cattle on the property west of yours." Amos stepped off the porch, keeping his hand near the revolver he'd taken to wearing on his hip. "What can I do for you?" "Heard you're having trouble with the Cedar Valley Development Company," Frank said. "Figured we should talk." They sat on the porch while Amos boiled coffee on the old stove. The Hollisters explained that they'd been ranching in the area for 40 years. And in that time, they'd watched Thornhill's companies steadily buy up smaller properties, often using legal pressure and intimidation. 3 ranches in the valley had sold in the last decade, all of them to the development company. "They're patient," Frank said, "and they'll spend years wearing you down, making your life hell, until selling seems like the only way out. Then they pay you a fraction of what the land's worth and move on to the next target. Why are you telling me this?" "Because we're next." Tom, the younger son, leaned forward. "Our property adjoins yours on the west. If Thornhill gets your land, he'll use it to pressure us. Cut off our water access, claim boundary disputes, file nuisance lawsuits. We've seen it happen to others, so you're offering to help me so I can help you." "That's about the size of it," Frank said without apology. "But it's not just strategy. Your uncle was a good neighbor, fair with the water rights, never tried to expand onto our grazing land, even though he probably could have. We owe his memory better than to stand by and watch his legacy get stolen." Amos considered this. He'd been so focused on his own fight that he hadn't thought about the broader pattern. Thornhill wasn't just after Whispering Pines. He was after the entire valley, one property at a time. and the ranchers who remained were starting to realize they needed to stand together. What kind of help are you offering? Testimony, for one. We can swear in court that we've seen you and your uncle maintaining that eastern boundary for years. That's 3 witnesses against their fabricated claims. Frank sipped his coffee. We can also help with the physical work. You're trying to manage 600 acres alone. That's not sustainable. You need help clearing fence lines, managing the water rights, keeping the property in good enough shape that they can't claim you're letting it fall into neglect. I can't pay you. Didn't ask for pay. Asked if you wanted help holding on to what's yours. David, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. My grandfather lost his ranch to men like Thornhill. Spent his last years bitter and broken because he couldn't stand up to them. I don't want to see that happen to anyone else. They shook hands all around, and Amos felt something ease in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. He had allies, not just Margaret and Joseph and Booth, but other ranchers who understood what was at stake. It wasn't much against Thornhill's money and influence, but it was more than he'd had a week ago. After the Hollisters left, Amos went through the house one more time, looking for anything else his uncle might have hidden. In the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser, wrapped in an old shirt, he found a bundle of letters tied with string. They were letters his uncle had written, but never sent, all addressed to Amos. Dozens of them, spanning the years since they'd last seen each other. Ezra had written about the seasons changing, about repairs he'd made to the house, about the quiet satisfaction of working land that meant something. And in almost every letter he wrote about hoping Amos would come back someday. You remind me of myself at your age, one letter read. Too proud to ask for help, too hurt to admit you need a place to belong. I hope you find what you're looking for out there in the world. But if you don't, if you ever need a home again, remember that Whispering Pines is waiting. It will always be waiting. Amos sat on the floor of his uncle's room, reading through tears he didn't bother to wipe away. He'd wasted 25 years staying away, too ashamed of his failures to face the one man who would have accepted him anyway. And now Ezra was gone, and all Amos had were these unsent letters and a chance to honor what his uncle had protected. He wouldn't waste that chance. Whatever it cost, whatever it took, he would hold this ground. Not just for the land's value, but for the faith Ezra had placed in him, for the legacy that stretched back to his great-grandfather's first stake in this wild country, for the future ranchers who would need places like this to still exist, free from men who saw only profit in every acre. The moon rose full and bright that night, casting silver light across the meadow. Amos stood at the window and looked out at his inheritance, the moss-covered house, the sagging barn, the wild land running to the mountains, and for the first time since arriving, he didn't see decay. He saw home, and he understood, finally, what his uncle had meant. The land remembers those who love it, and in loving it, Amos was becoming someone his younger self wouldn't recognize. Someone with roots, someone worth being. The fight was far from over. The lawsuit still loomed. Thornhill's threats still hung in the air like a coming storm. But Amos Ray, the drifting cowboy who'd spent his life running from anything that might hold him down, had finally found something worth standing still for. Now he just had to survive long enough to keep it. The call came from a number Amos didn't recognize. On a cold November morning, when frost covered the meadow like spilled sugar, he almost didn't answer. He'd learned to be wary of unexpected contact. But something made him pick up the old rotary phone in the kitchen. Mr. Ray, this is Dr. Ellen Vasquez. I was your uncle's physician. Amos straightened, suddenly alert. Yes, ma'am. I need to speak with you in person. It's about Ezra's death. Can you come to my office this afternoon? Is something wrong? There was a long pause. I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. Please. It's important. Dr. Vasquez's office was in a small medical building on the edge of Cedar Bluff. She was a woman in her 50s, with intelligent eyes and the weary manner of someone carrying a burden too heavy to share. She closed the door behind Amos and gestured to a chair. I've wrestled with this for 6 months, she said without preamble. With patient confidentiality, with fear of reprisal, with my own conscience. But I can't stay silent anymore. Silent about what? She pulled a file from her desk drawer and opened it. Your uncle came to see me 3 times in the months before he died. He was experiencing symptoms, headaches, nausea, weakness, confusion. I ran blood tests, and what I found concerned me deeply. Amos leaned forward. What did you find? Elevated levels of arsenic. Not enough to be immediately fatal, but consistent with chronic low-level poisoning. She met his eyes. Someone was poisoning your uncle, Mr. Ray. Slowly, deliberately, over a period of months. The room seemed to tilt. Amos gripped the arms of his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. You're saying someone murdered him? I'm saying the evidence suggests it strongly. I reported my findings to the sheriff's office, but Sheriff Hendricks dismissed it. Said Ezra probably got into some old pesticides or contaminated well water. The death certificate lists natural causes, heart failure, and the coroner never performed a thorough autopsy. She pushed the file across the desk. I made copies of everything. The blood tests, my notes, my official report to the sheriff. I thought you should have them. Amos opened the file with shaking hands. The medical terminology was dense, but the numbers told a clear story. His uncle's blood had shown progressively higher levels of arsenic over 3 months. The final test, taken 2 weeks before his death, showed levels that were approaching fatal. Why are you telling me this now? Because I heard about the lawsuit. About the pressure you're facing from Thornhill's company. And because... She hesitated, then continued. Because 3 days before he died, Ezra came to my office one last time. He knew he was dying. Said he suspected what was happening but couldn't prove it. He asked me to keep these records safe and to give them to his heir if anyone ever came asking questions. He knew someone was killing him. I believe so. And I think he knew who. She pulled out another document, this one handwritten. He left this letter with me. Made me promise to keep it sealed unless his heir faced the same threats he did. The envelope was addressed simply to Amos, if he needs the truth. Amos opened it with trembling fingers and read his uncle's final words, written in the same neat handwriting that filled the ledgers and journals. Amos, if you're reading this, it means Dr. Vasquez believed you needed to know the truth. I'm dying, and not from natural causes. For months, I've been sick with symptoms that don't match any illness I know. My food tastes off. My water sometimes has a bitter edge. I'm being poisoned, slowly and carefully, by someone who wants this land badly enough to kill for it. I can't prove who, but I know why. 2 months ago, a geologist came to the ranch secretly, sent by someone who paid him well to keep quiet. He told me the copper deposits under the eastern section are richer than anyone suspected. More than that, there's a natural gas formation that could be worth hundreds of millions if properly developed. Someone knows this. Someone who wants me gone so they can take the land. I won't give them the satisfaction of dying afraid. I'm making arrangements to leave everything to you, with legal protections that will make it harder for them to steal. But you need to know what you're inheriting isn't just land. It's a fight that cost me my life. Be smarter than I was. Don't trust the local law. Don't think that being right will protect you. These are people who kill for profit and sleep soundly doing it. The land is worth the fight, Amos, but your life is worth more. If it comes to choosing, choose to live. The Ray family has held this ground for 5 generations, but no piece of land is worth your death. Whatever you decide, know that I was proud to leave it to you. You were always stronger than you thought, braver than you believed. That summer when you were 12, I saw the man you'd become. I just hope I lived long enough for you to see it too. Fight if you can. Run if you must, but live, nephew. That's all that matters in the end. Ezra Amos sat in silence, reading the letter 3 times, each word burning itself into his memory. His uncle had known, had felt the poison working in his body, had understood he was being murdered, and had still fought to protect the land long enough to pass it on. I'm sorry, Dr. Vasquez said quietly. I should have fought harder to investigate properly. Should have gone over Hendrix's head, contacted state authorities. But I was afraid. Thornhill has a long reach, and doctors who cross him tend to lose their licenses over manufactured complaints. It's not your fault. Amos folded the letter carefully. You kept these records safe. That's more than most would do. What will you do with them? I don't know yet. He stood, taking the file and the letter. But thank you for your courage and for honoring my uncle's trust. He drove back to the ranch in a daze, his mind churning through implications. If Ezra had been murdered, and the evidence seemed overwhelming, then this wasn't just a legal battle over property rights. It was something darker, more dangerous. Men who would poison a stubborn old rancher wouldn't hesitate to do worse to his nephew. The harassment, the threats, the pressure, it had all been building toward something. And now Amos knew what. They'd killed once for this land. They'd kill again if they had to. He thought about his uncle's final words. Run if you must, but live. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice. Take whatever settlement he could get and disappear. Start over somewhere Thornhill's reach didn't extend. He'd spent his whole life running. One more time wouldn't matter. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't run. Couldn't run. Not now, knowing what his uncle had endured. Not with Ezra's faith in him written out in that final letter. Back at the ranch, he called Samuel Booth and told him everything. The lawyer's silence stretched long after Amos finished speaking. This changes everything, Booth finally said. If we can prove Thornhill's company was behind your uncle's murder, we're not just fighting a property dispute. We're talking about criminal conspiracy, homicide. The FBI would have jurisdiction. Can we prove it? The medical evidence is compelling, but connecting it directly to Thornhill will be difficult. We need more. A witness, documentation, something that ties him to the poisoning. He paused. Amos, if you pursue this, you're painting a target on your back. These people have already killed once. I know. Then you need to take precautions. Don't eat or drink anything you haven't prepared yourself. Vary your routine. Consider staying in town, somewhere with witnesses. I'm not leaving the ranch. Then at least tell people what you know. Make it public enough that your death would raise questions. Protect yourself by making sure they can't kill you quietly. After hanging up, Amos sat at the kitchen table with his uncle's letter spread before him. Natural gas formations worth hundreds of millions. No wonder Thornhill had been so persistent, so willing to cross moral lines. This wasn't about copper or railroad routes anymore. This was about a fortune that dwarfed the already considerable value of the mineral rights. And Thornhill had killed for it once, would kill again if Amos threatened to expose what had happened. The smart play was to go to the FBI, turn over the evidence, and let federal authorities handle it. But that could take years. Years of investigations and legal proceedings, while Thornhill's lawyers tied everything up in knots. Years of living with a target on his back, never knowing when they might decide to eliminate the problem permanently. Or he could do what his uncle had done, stand his ground and fight on his own terms. Make enough noise that backing down wasn't an option. Force Thornhill to either deal honestly or face public exposure. It was a gamble that had cost Ezra his life. But maybe that was the point. Maybe some things were worth dying for. Not just the land itself, but the principle of refusing to let evil men win through murder and intimidation. Amos looked around the kitchen. At the house his family had built and held for 5 generations. At the moss-covered walls that had sheltered his uncle during those final poisoned months. At the land beyond the windows that stretched toward mountains that had stood for millennia and would stand for millennia more. The land remembers. And now Amos remembered too. Remembered who he was, who his family had been, what they'd stood for. They didn't run. They didn't surrender. They held the line, even when holding it cost everything. He would expose what Thornhill had done, would fight for justice for his uncle and for all the others who'd been crushed by men who thought wealth gave them the right to take what they wanted. But first, he needed to survive long enough to see it through. And that meant being smarter, more careful, and more dangerous than he'd ever been in his drifting cowboy life. The war for Whispering Pines Ranch had just become something more than a legal dispute. It had become personal, deadly, and absolutely unavoidable. Amos Ray might be outgunned and outmatched, but he was through running. Through accepting defeat. Through letting the powerful prey on the powerless without consequence. Let Thornhill come. Let him send his lawyers, his thugs, his poison. Amos would be ready. And one way or another, the truth would come to light. The first thing Amos did was tell everyone. Not just Booth and Joseph and Margaret, but the Hollisters, Mrs. Chen at the land office, even the owner of the feed store where he bought supplies. He made copies of Dr. Vasquez's file and distributed them, each one with a note explaining what they contained and who to contact if anything happened to him. "You're making yourself a harder target," Booth explained when they met to discuss strategy. "If you die now, everyone will know it wasn't an accident. That's your best protection, but protection only went so far." 3 days after his visit to Dr. Vasquez, someone took a shot at him. Amos was riding the eastern fence line, checking the boundaries that Thornhill's company had challenged in the lawsuit. He heard the crack of the rifle before he felt the bullet pass close enough to his head that it displaced the air. He threw himself from the saddle and rolled behind a fallen log, his heart hammering, as 2 more shots kicked up dirt near his position. Then silence. The shooter was gone, having made his point. The message was clear: back off or the next shot won't miss. But the attempt backfired. By that evening, half the county knew someone had tried to kill Amos Ray. The local newspaper ran a story. The state police opened an investigation. And suddenly, the quiet pressure campaign Thornhill had been waging became public knowledge. "He's losing control of the narrative," Booth said at an emergency meeting at Margaret's diner. Present were Amos, Booth, Joseph, the 3 Hollisters, Dr. Vasquez, and a new face, a journalist named Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, who worked for a newspaper in Cheyenne. "The shooting was sloppy," Sarah said, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. "Thornhill's too smart to order something that obvious. This was probably a hired hand who got overzealous, but it's given us an opening. People are asking questions now, and I can amplify those questions." She'd already written a piece for her paper about the property dispute, the suspicious death of Ezra Ray, and the growing conflict between a lone rancher and a powerful development company. It was scheduled to run in 3 days, and she'd promised to follow it up with more stories if Amos could provide additional evidence. "What we need," Booth said, "is proof that connects Thornhill directly to either your uncle's death or the harassment you've faced. Right now, we have circumstantial evidence, strong circumstantial evidence, but not enough to bring criminal charges." "How do we get that proof?" Amos asked. "We make him come to us." Force his hand. Booth leaned forward, his expression serious. "The court date for the boundary dispute is in 2 weeks. That's when Thornhill will make his move, legally speaking. But if he's desperate enough, if he thinks you're about to go public with information that could destroy him, he might try something more direct. You want to use me as bait. I want to create a situation where Thornhill feels cornered enough to act carelessly. And when he does, we document everything. Record every conversation. Photograph every threat. Build a case that even his bought and paid for judges can't dismiss." It was risky, but Amos was out of safe options. That night he and Joseph worked to set up a system of protection and documentation. They installed trail cameras along the main access points to the property, hidden devices that would photograph anyone coming or going. Joseph taught Amos how to use a small voice recorder, showing him how to keep it running during any confrontation or unexpected visit. "Your uncle should have done this," Joseph said quietly. "Should have documented the threats, recorded the conversations. But he was from a different generation, thought he could handle it all himself." "I'm not him," Amos said. "I'm not too proud to accept help." Margaret provided support in her own way. She spread word through the diner's regular customers, most of whom were ranchers and townspeople, about what was happening at Whispering Pines. Public opinion began to shift. What had been mockery of a poor cowboy's foolish inheritance became sympathy for a man fighting against overwhelming odds. Even some of Thornhill's own employees began to have doubts. A surveyor who'd been hired to document the disputed boundary came forward privately with information that he'd been told to misrepresent the markers. A clerk from the development company's office leaked documents showing that they'd deliberately backdated their maintenance claims. The tide was turning, slowly but perceptibly. Thornhill's carefully constructed case was developing cracks, but the development magnate wasn't finished. 5 days before the court date, Amos received a visitor he hadn't expected, Victor Thornhill himself. The man arrived in a black luxury car, driven by a stone-faced bodyguard who waited by the vehicle while Thornhill approached the house. He was in his 60s, distinguished-looking, with silver hair and expensive clothes that seemed absurdly out of place against the moss-covered ranch house. But his eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who'd built an empire and crushed anyone who stood in his way. "Mr. Ray," he said with a smile that didn't touch those eyes. "I believe it's time we talk directly." Amos kept his hand near his revolver and activated the voice recorder in his shirt pocket. "I've got nothing to say to you. Perhaps not. But you should hear what I have to say." Thornhill looked around the property with an appraising eye. "You've done remarkable work here. The place looks better than it has in years. It's clear you care about it. Get to the point. The point, Mr. Ray, is that you're out of your depth. You think you can fight me, fight my company, my resources, my influence, and somehow win. But you can't. No one can. I've been acquiring land in this valley for 40 years, and I've never failed to get what I want. There's a first time for everything." Thornhill's smile faded. "I'm prepared to offer you $500,000 for the property. Full payment, immediate transfer. You walk away wealthy, and we forget this unpleasantness ever happened." "No, you're being foolish. That journalist Sarah Chen, the stories she's planning to write, they won't change anything. I have lawyers who will bury her in defamation suits. I have judges who will rule in my favor regardless of evidence. I have resources you cannot match. Maybe. But I have something you don't." Amos met his eyes steadily. "I have the truth, and I have nothing left to lose." Something flickered in Thornhill's expression, a crack in his composed facade. "Everyone has something to lose, Mr. Ray. Your friends, for instance. The Hollisters, that Indian who works for you, the woman who runs the diner. Accidents happen to people who get involved in disputes that don't concern them. That sounds like a threat. It's a statement of fact. This valley can be a dangerous place for those who don't know when to back down." He stepped closer, and Amos's hand moved to the revolver's grip. Thornhill noticed, but didn't seem concerned. "I'm not a monster, Mr. Ray. I'm a businessman. Your uncle understood that, even if he never accepted my offers. We had a certain respect for each other in the end." "Respect?" Amos's voice was cold. "You poisoned him, murdered him slowly because he wouldn't give you what you wanted." The words hung in the air between them. For just a moment Thornhill's mask slipped, and Amos saw something raw beneath it, not guilt but calculation, as if he was weighing how much Amos actually knew. "Careful with your accusations. Mr. Ray, slander is a serious offense. It's not slander if it's true. I have medical records. Blood tests showing arsenic poisoning. A letter from my uncle explaining what was happening to him. And once Sarah Chen publishes her investigation, everyone will know what you did." Thornhill was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, almost contemplative. "Your uncle was a stubborn man, stubborn to the point of stupidity. He could have lived comfortably, sold this land for a fair price, enjoyed his final years in peace. Instead, he chose to fight. And fighting has consequences. Is that a confession?" "It's an observation." Thornhill turned to leave, then paused. "You have until the court date to reconsider my offer. After that, I'm afraid things will become much more difficult for you. The law is on my side, Mr. Ray. Public opinion, evidence, truth. None of it matters when the system is designed to protect men like me." He walked back to his car and drove away, leaving Amos standing on the porch with the voice recorder still running in his pocket. That night, Amos gathered his allies at the ranch house. They listened to the recording 3 times, parsing every word, every implication. Thornhill had been careful not to directly confess, but the threat was clear. More than that, his reaction to the accusation of poisoning had been telling, not outright denial, but careful deflection. "It's not enough for criminal charges," Booth said. "But combined with everything else, the medical records, the pattern of harassment, the surveyor's testimony, it builds a compelling case." "What about public opinion?" Frank Hollister asked. If Sarah Chen publishes this recording along with her investigation, people will draw their own conclusions. Public opinion won't stop Thornhill from winning in court, Booth said. Judge Morrison is firmly in his pocket. Unless we can force a change of venue or find evidence that directly implicates Thornhill in a crime, he'll rule against us. Then we need a different strategy. Amos looked around the room at the people who'd stood with him. Margaret with her steady kindness, Joseph with his quiet strength, the Hollisters with their determination to protect their own land by protecting his, Dr. Vasquez with her courage to speak truth despite the risk, Booth with his legal expertise and moral clarity, and Sarah Chen with her pen and her platform. What are you thinking? Margaret asked. I'm thinking that Thornhill is right about one thing. I can't beat him in a system he controls. But I don't have to beat him in court. I just have to make it too costly for him to win. Amos spread out the documents on the table, the medical records, the property deeds, the survey maps, the correspondence going back 3 generations. We're going to make this story so public, so documented, so undeniable, that even if he wins legally, he loses everything that matters. His reputation, his business relationships, his ability to operate in the shadows. You're talking about a campaign, Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. Not just one story, but a series. Building public pressure, forcing other journalists to pay attention, maybe even attracting federal interest. Exactly. We have 2 weeks until the court date. 2 weeks to make sure that everyone in Wyoming, everyone in the country, if we can manage it, knows what Victor Thornhill did to my uncle and what he's trying to do to this land. It was ambitious, maybe impossible. But as Amos looked around the table at the faces of people who'd chosen to stand with him, he felt something he hadn't felt since arriving at Whispering Pines Ranch. He felt hope. The fight wasn't over. The danger hadn't passed. Thornhill still had power, resources, and no moral qualms about using either. But Amos wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The land remembers, his uncle had written. And now, thanks to the people gathered in this room, the world would remember too. Would remember what happened here, what was at stake, and what one man and his allies did to stand against injustice, win or lose. They would make sure the truth survived. The morning of the court date arrived with unseasonable warmth, the November sun burning off the frost before Amos had even finished his coffee. He dressed carefully, his best jeans, a clean shirt, the bolo tie his uncle had left in the dresser. He strapped on the Colt Peacemaker his great-grandfather had carried, not because he expected to use it, but because wearing it made him feel connected to the generations of Ray men who'd held this land, the courthouse in Cedar. Bluff was a brick building that had stood since territorial days, its courtroom unchanged from the time when disputes were settled with testimony from men who still remembered fighting Indians and claiming homesteads. Amos arrived early with Samuel Booth and found the place already crowded. The Hollisters were there, dressed in their Sunday clothes. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, but her expression fierce. Joseph stood at the back, his weathered face impassive, but his eyes alert. Dr. Vasquez had come, along with Mrs. Chen and her granddaughter Sarah, whose newspaper articles had been picked up by larger papers across the state, and seated on the opposite side of the aisle, surrounded by lawyers in expensive suits, was Victor Thornhill. He looked relaxed, confident, a man who'd bought the outcome before the trial even started. Judge Harvey Morrison took the bench at 9 o'clock sharp. He was a heavy man with jowls that hung over his collar and eyes that revealed nothing. He'd served on the bench for 20 years, and everyone in the courtroom knew who'd ensured his re-election every time. This court will hear the matter of Cedar Valley Development Company versus Amos Ray regarding property. Boundaries at Whispering Pines Ranch, Morrison announced. Counselors, present your opening statements. Thornhill's lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Vance, stood and delivered a polished presentation about adverse possession, documented maintenance, and the company's long-standing presence on the disputed land. She presented photographs, affidavits, and carefully prepared logs that painted a picture of Cedar Valley Development as responsible stewards of abandoned property. It was all lies, but she presented it with the confidence of someone who knew the judge wouldn't look too closely. When she finished, Booth stood. He was just a small-town lawyer in a worn suit, and Amos could see people in the gallery underestimating him. But when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority. Your Honor, what we're witnessing here today is not a property dispute. It's an attempted theft dressed in legal language. The Ray family has held clear title to Whispering Pines Ranch since 1876. The property has never been abandoned, never been unmanaged, never been available for adverse possession. What Cedar Valley Development has presented is a carefully constructed fiction, and with the court's permission, we can prove it. Morrison frowned. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Booth, and I'm prepared to back it with evidence. Your Honor, we have testimony from witnesses who worked the land with Ezra Ray. We have county records showing no permits or legal presence from the development company. We have survey maps that prove their boundary markers were placed fraudulently. He paused. And we have evidence suggesting that Ezra Ray's death was not natural, but the result of deliberate poisoning intended to clear the way for this land grab. The courtroom erupted. Morrison pounded his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Reporters were scribbling notes. Spectators were whispering, and Thornhill's composed expression had fractured into something cold and dangerous. Mr. Booth, you will confine your statements to the matter at hand, Morrison said sharply. Unsubstantiated accusations of murder have no place in this proceeding. They're not unsubstantiated. Your Honor, we have medical records, blood tests, and expert testimony from Dr. Ellen Vasquez, who treated Mr. Ray before his death. Vance was on her feet. Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to prejudice the court. There is no murder investigation, no criminal charges. The defense is manufacturing a conspiracy theory to distract from the facts of this case. The facts, Booth said quietly, are that Ezra Ray was systematically poisoned with arsenic while Victor Thornhill's company made repeated attempts to acquire his land. The facts are that Amos Ray, upon inheriting, faced immediate harassment, threats, and even an attempted shooting. The facts are that the boundary markers Mr. Thornhill's company claims to have placed were driven into the ground weeks ago, not years. He pulled out a photograph, one of the trail camera images showing a man in Cedar Valley Development uniform hammering stakes into the ground at night. The timestamp was clearly visible, 3 weeks before the lawsuit was filed. We have photographs, Your Honor, of their employees falsifying evidence, of the very fraud this court is being asked to legitimize. Morrison's face had gone red. I will review this evidence in chambers. Court is adjourned until 2 o'clock. He left the bench in a hurry, and the courtroom exploded into chaos. Amos sat in the middle of it all, watching Thornhill across the aisle. The older man's mask was gone completely now, replaced by naked fury. Their eyes met, and Amos saw the truth written there. Thornhill had expected this to be easy, had expected a poor cowboy to fold under pressure, to accept whatever settlement was offered, to disappear quietly like so many others had. But Amos Ray wasn't disappearing. He was fighting, and fighting publicly. And suddenly, Thornhill's carefully controlled narrative was unraveling in front of witnesses and reporters, and people who were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. In that moment, Amos knew he'd won something important. Not the case necessarily. Morrison might still rule against him out of loyalty or corruption. But he'd won the larger fight. The truth was out, documented and witnessed. Impossible to bury. Whatever happened next, Victor Thornhill would never be able to operate in the shadows again. The afternoon session never happened. At 1:30, while Amos and his allies gathered in a conference room at Booth's office to prepare for round 2, the door opened and Patricia Vance entered. She looked tired, her earlier confidence replaced by professional resignation. My client wishes to withdraw the lawsuit, she said without preamble. We'll file the dismissal paperwork this afternoon, Booth leaned back in his chair, surprised but cautious. Just like that. Just like that. Cedar Valley Development Company acknowledges Mr. Ray's clear title to the entirety of Whispering Pines Ranch, including all disputed boundaries. Will also provide written confirmation that no adverse possession claim exists or will be pursued in the future. And in exchange, nothing. Unconditional withdrawal. She set a folder on the table. Additionally, Mr. Thornhill has authorized me to make a formal apology for any distress caused during this dispute. He recognizes that emotions ran high on both sides. Amos studied her face, looking for the trap. What changed his mind? Vance hesitated, then seemed to decide honesty was the best approach. 3 things. First, while the court was in recess, Sarah Chen's newspaper ran a follow-up story that's being picked up nationally. The headline is "Mining Magnate Accused of Murder in Land Dispute." Second, the FBI field office in Cheyenne called my office an hour ago. They're opening an investigation into allegations of criminal activity related to Ezra Ray's death. And third, she paused. Judge Morrison recused himself. He's announced his retirement effective immediately. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Morrison's recusal meant the case would be reassigned to a judge Thornhill couldn't control. The FBI investigation meant federal scrutiny of everything Thornhill had done, and the national news coverage meant hiding was no longer an option. Thornhill's cutting his losses, Booth said softly. Getting out before this becomes a criminal case he can't win. My client is a businessman, Vance said carefully. He makes rational decisions based on cost-benefit analysis. Continuing this dispute no longer serves his interests, because he might end up in prison for murder, Joseph said from his position by the window. Vance didn't confirm or deny it. She simply placed a business card on the table. If you have any questions about the dismissal paperwork, contact my office. Good day, gentlemen. After she left, the room erupted. Margaret hugged Amos hard enough to make his ribs ache. The Hollisters were grinning and shaking hands all around. Sarah was already on her phone, calling in the story to her editor. Even Booth allowed himself a rare smile, but Amos felt oddly quiet inside. He'd won. The land was his, free and clear, with Thornhill's company backing off completely. The lawsuit was over. The threats would stop. He could rebuild the ranch in peace, develop it or preserve it as he chose, live the life his uncle had wanted for him. He'd won. So why did it feel incomplete? That evening, after the celebrations had died down and his allies had gone home, Amos drove to the cemetery where his uncle was buried. The stone was simple granite, marked with Ezra Ray's name and dates. No flowery epitaph, just like the man himself. Amos sat in the grass beside the grave and told his uncle everything. About the court case, about Thornhill's retreat, about the FBI investigation that might finally bring justice for what had been done. He talked about the friends who'd stood with him, about the land they'd protected together, about the future he was trying to build on the foundation Ezra had left. "I'm sorry I didn't come back sooner," he said to the stone. "Sorry you had to face all this alone. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. The land's safe. The family legacy is safe. You can rest." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Amos felt something settle inside him. Peace, maybe, or purpose. The knowledge that he'd honored his uncle's sacrifice by refusing to let it be in vain. He returned to Whispering Pines as darkness fell. And for the first time since inheriting the place, he didn't scan the shadows for threats or listen for suspicious sounds. He just walked through the front door of the moss-covered house and felt, finally, truly, like he was coming home. The next morning, he woke to find Margaret's truck in the driveway. She'd brought breakfast and news. "The FBI arrested Dalton Hayes last night," she said, setting a basket of biscuits on the kitchen table. "He's cooperating with their investigation. Apparently, he handled the arsenic purchase and delivery, though he claims he didn't know it would be used to poison anyone. Will it lead back to Thornhill? The agents think so. Hayes kept records, dates, amounts, instructions he received. He's smart enough to know that cooperating is his best chance at a reduced sentence." She poured coffee for both of them. It's going to be a long investigation, but the prosecutor I spoke to thinks they have a solid case." Amos sat at his uncle's kitchen table, in his uncle's house on his uncle's land, and felt the full weight of what had been accomplished. Justice might still take time, but it was coming. The land was protected. The truth was known, and he, Amos Ray, the drifting cowboy who'd owned nothing and belonged nowhere, had found something worth holding on to, had found in the act of fighting for it that he was worth holding on to too. The land remembers, Ezra had written, and now Amos understood. The land remembered those who loved it, those who fought for it, those who refused to let it be destroyed by greed. It remembered in the way roots grew deep and water ran clear, and seasons turned in their eternal cycle. His great-grandfather had staked this claim in 1876. His uncle had guarded it through decades of threats. And now Amos would carry it forward, would honor their legacy by building something that mattered. The fight was over. The real work was just beginning. The morning after the courthouse ruling came quiet and clear. Amos stood on the porch of his uncle's ranch, his ranch now legally and finally, watching the sun climb over the wild woods. The moss still clung to some of the buildings, but it looked different somehow, less like decay and more like patience, like the land itself had been waiting all these years for someone to see it properly. Clementine brayed from the paddock, impatient for her morning feed. Amos smiled and made his way down the steps, his boots striking wood that no longer creaked with rot. He'd spent the last 3 weeks replacing boards, clearing brush, and beginning the slow work of restoration. Not because the appraisal demanded it, but because the place deserved it. The town had gone quiet after Judge Morrison's ruling. The Holloway brothers disappeared the day the verdict came down, their lawyer packing up files with a tight-lipped nod that said more than any apology could. Word spread fast in a place like this. By evening, everyone knew that Amos Ray, poor, laughed at Amos, had won his inheritance fair and square. More than that, they knew about the mineral rights, the railroad easements, the $10 million in value sitting beneath land they'd written off as cursed. Some folks had the decency to look ashamed when they passed him on the street now. Others just looked away. Amos didn't hold it against them. People believed what they needed to believe, saw what they wanted to see. He'd done the same thing himself for years, convinced he was nothing but a drifter with empty pockets and fewer prospects. Martha Kenny had been the first to apologize, appearing at his door 2 days after the ruling with a basket of preserves and red-rimmed eyes. She'd stood on his porch wringing her hands, explaining how she'd just repeated what everyone else was saying, how she hadn't meant real harm. Amos had invited her in for coffee and listened while she talked about her own struggles, her late husband's debts, the weight of trying to keep up appearances in a town that never forgot your failures. "We're all just trying to get by," she'd said finally, wiping her eyes with a worn handkerchief. "Sometimes that makes us small. Sometimes it does," Amos had agreed. "But we can choose different tomorrow." She'd left with a lighter step, and the next day her son had shown up offering to help clear the eastern fence line. Amos had accepted, not because he needed the help particularly, but because some bridges were worth building. Now, as he poured grain for Clementine, he thought about all the things that had changed and all the things that hadn't. The ranch was his. The money was his. Most of it anyway, after legal fees and back taxes. He could sell it all tomorrow, walk away with enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Buy a place in town, maybe, or head south where winters were gentler. But he wouldn't. This place held something more valuable than mineral rights or railroad easements. It held memory. His uncle's calloused hands teaching him to mend fence. Summer mornings when the world felt full of possibility. The particular smell of pine and creek water that meant home, even when home was just a season of childhood. He'd found his uncle's old sign in the barn 3 days ago, buried under tarps and forgotten tools, and carved oak, weathered but still solid, bearing the name his uncle had given this place, Ray's Rest. Amos had spent an evening restoring it, sanding away years of neglect, treating the wood, retracing the carved letters with careful hands. Tomorrow he'd hang it at the entrance to the property, not as a monument to wealth or vindication, but as a simple statement of fact. This was his family's land. This was where he belonged. The sound of an approaching vehicle pulled him from his thoughts. A truck he didn't recognize came up the drive, stirring dust that caught the morning light. Amos straightened, hand instinctively moving to check that his uncle's old revolver was still tucked in his belt. Old habits. But the man who stepped out wore a surveyor's vest and carried a clipboard, not a weapon. He introduced himself as Dale Morrison, the judge's nephew, sent to map the property lines now that ownership was settled. "Your land extends further than you might think," Dale said, unrolling a survey map across the hood of his truck. "Clear to the ridgeline, and east all the way to Sawyer Creek. That's nearly 200 acres of prime timber, plus the mineral rights underneath." Amos studied the map, tracing the boundaries with one finger. 200 acres. Enough space for a man to breathe, to build, to finally put down roots that might hold. "What will you do with it?" Dale asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Amos considered the question. A month ago he wouldn't have had an answer. He'd have mumbled something vague about selling or keeping his options open. But standing here now, with morning sun warming his shoulders and Clementine's contented munching filling the quiet, he knew exactly what he'd do. "Live on it," he said simply. "Fix it up proper. Maybe run some cattle again like my uncle did. Keep it in the family." Dale nodded, rolling up his map. "Seems right," he said. "Place like this deserves someone who sees its value." After the surveyor left, Amos walked the southern boundary, following the creek that marked the edge of his land. He thought about his uncle, about the legacy left behind in weathered wood and hidden deeds, about the town that had laughed at him, and the dignity he'd found in refusing to laugh at himself. The ranch wasn't just worth $10 million. It was worth something money couldn't measure, the chance to be more than what others expected, to claim not just land, but purpose. As he headed back toward the house, Amos Ray smiled. Poor no more, but rich in ways that mattered most. And tomorrow, he'd hang that sign.